Welcome back to Campfire Stories. I'm Clint Sensei. You know, the scariest stories aren't the ones made up entirely in the dark. The ones that truly haunt us are the tales rooted in reality, because in every good campfire story, there is a grain of truth, a real piece of human history, a real place, or a real warning. And that is what makes them truly terrifying. Tonight, I challenge you to look past the shadows and find the lesson buried inside the history. Lean in, get comfortable, and let's look for the truth. I call this story Full Moon, Empty Road. The Friday evening ritual was the same, but the relief it brought never dulled. As he often did when seeking to let the cares and troubles of the world fade away, James turned the key in the ignition of his 1984 Oldsmobile 88, and the engine instantly rumbled to life and settled into idle with a low, familiar hum. The sound was as much a part of the ritual as the faded scent of dust and oldness that lived in the car's upholstery. He let it idle for a moment, the vibration traveling up through the steering column and into his hands via the hard plastic steering wheel, a steady, mechanical heartbeat. He pulled away from the curb, the suspension groaning softly as it absorbed every bump and flaw of the road while he navigated the grid of his North Las Vegas suburb. Block after block of low-slung houses, their windows glowing a dull amber, slid past. The air, still radiating the day's stored heat, smelled of hot asphalt. He drove with the window down, his elbow resting on the frame, his long-sleeved shirt still smelling faintly of sawdust and drywall compound. The week's fatigue was a physical weight in his bones, a satisfying ache that came from framing walls under the Nevada sun. But as the last of the street lights thinned out in his rear-view mirror, the weight began to lift, replaced by a quiet, expanding sense of solace. The city bled away into the open desert. The road ahead straightened into a black ribbon, unspooling under the vast moonlit sky. He shifted in his seat, making that peculiar soft sound denim makes when brushing against cloth seats. The scent of the city's exhaust was replaced by something sharper and cleaner, the medicinal tang of creosote bush, the dry perfume of the open range. The moon, completely full, washed the landscape in a spectral silver light, turning the Joshua trees into huddled praying figures and the distant peaks into jagged cutouts against the starfield. His destination was Granite Peak, a lonely jut of rock miles from anywhere, where he planned to find a quiet place under the stars to wait for the sunrise. It was a place of pure silence, a blank slate for a tired mind to regenerate. The Oldsmobile's headlights were two weak yellow cones pushing back the darkness. The solitude was a physical presence, a welcome emptiness. There were no other cars, no distant city glow, no songs on the radio, only the hum of the engine and the soft cushioned ride that only those older American land barges could provide. He felt his mind, cluttered all week with measurements and schedules, begin to settle. The tension in his shoulders unknotted. He was alone, and the world felt at ease, predictable, safe. Then, far ahead, a glint, a single sharp reflection of his headlights on glass. A shape resolved out of the darkness. A vehicle, long, sleek, and white, pulled off to the side of the highway. Its hazard lights weren't on. As he drew closer, he saw two figures standing expectantly near the front of the car, nearly motionless. The moonlight caught the startling white of their shirts and trousers. They didn't wave. They just stood, as if they'd been waiting for him. James's foot eased off the accelerator. The instinct to stop was a reflex, an unspoken rule of the barren landscape. Out here, You stopped. The desert was unforgiving, and the unspoken code of helpfulness was as real as the asphalt beneath his tires. A broken belt? A dead battery? A flat tire? The distance between a minor inconvenience and a fatal situation was measured in water and shade. His own desire for solitude, his peaceful escape, was instantly set aside. He was a practical man. A problem presented itself, and a solution was required. His speed allowed him to see the way the car sagged into the driver's side rear. He slowed enough to confirm that it was indeed a flat tire. Then he flicked on his turn signal. The rhythmic click loud in the quiet cabin, and the Oldsmobile's tires crunched onto the gravel and sand shoulder as he pulled over in front of the other car. The Oldsmobile's headlights had swept across the other vehicle as James eased to a stop, the beams catching the two figures still standing motionless beside the gleaming chrome of the front bumper. Up close, the car's paint reflected the moonlight. The men wore white dress shirts tucked into white slacks, the fabric crisp and uncreased, standing out clearly against the desert sand and the night sky. No dust on their shoes, no sweat on their brows. The temperature had dropped into the low 50s, yet neither man shivered. James killed the engine and stepped out, the crunch of his work boots on gravel loud in the silence. The desert air smelled of creosote and mesquite. He raised a hand in greeting. "Evening! Looks like you've got some trouble there." The first man, the one standing closer to him and the apparent driver, regarded James with a placid expression. His face was unlined, his eyes dark and still, while he responded in the affirmative in a pleasing baritone voice, gesturing with a casual wave towards the flat tire. His companion stood a pace to his right, identically clean, but opposingly silent. James stepped forward with a friendly smile and extended a hand before he glanced down at it. Still had the faint dust of construction work on it. Aware of the cleanliness of their attire, he quickly retracted it while remaining polite. "Wouldn't want to get those clothes dirty," James said. "Do you have a spare?" The second man stepped around to the vehicle's passenger door and pushed the trunk release button in the glove box. Again, without a word. "Please," said the first man, while gesturing toward the trunk. James walked toward the rear of the car and lifted the trunk lid completely, allowing the moonlight to spill into the space. On the hump in the rear of the trunk, up against the back of the rear seats, was the covered spare. James removed the black felt-like covering and worked at the wing nut that held it in place. Lifting the tire out with a small grunt, James set it upright and rolled it over next to the flat before returning to look for the lug wrench in the jack. After lifting the trunk cover, James realized that neither were there. "I've got a jack in my trunk. I can have you back on the road in 20 minutes," James called cordially as he walked past the two men, still standing silently in white at the front of the car. James popped his own trunk, lifted the trunk cover, and retrieved the bumper jack and lug wrench that were under it. The tools felt solid in his hands, grounding. This was a problem he understood. A flat tire was an easy problem. A flat tire had a solution. He crouched beside the sedan's rear wheel, laying the jack next to him but off the road. The lug nuts were torqued tight, the kind of torque that came from one of those fancy air compressor run power tools, not a roadside repair. He braced the wrench and threw his weight against it. The first nut gave with a sharp creak that was instantly swallowed by the desert. This was always easier to do by hand when the car was still completely on the ground. The men did not move. They stood exactly where they had been, their shadows pooling at their feet. James worked the second nut loose, then the third, aware of their stillness pressing against his back. The same stillness that a pre-dawn darkness brought when the temperature hit its lowest. James continued working silently to loosen all the lug nuts before moving to the rear of the car to get a good purchase for the base of the bumper jack. He brushed the gravel as flat as possible before making sure the base wouldn't move as he set it against the bumper. He removed the flat and rolled it aside, the rubber cold and stiff under his fingers. The spare was a compact donut, pristine, never used. He lifted it onto the studs and spun the first lug nut into place. There was a whisper of movement in the sand, followed by the crunch of gravel as the first man moved towards him. But James was quick to say, "I've got this. It will only be a few more minutes. Don't want to get those white clothes dirty." His voice too loud in the quiet. He meant it to be politely reassuring, but nothing. No response. No more movement. The first man's gaze had returned to the horizon, as if James were not there at all. The second man had not shifted his weight outside the passenger car door since standing after popping the trunk. Not a single scuff of a shoe on the sand, not a cleared throat. James tightened the lug nuts in a star pattern, just as he had been taught. The sound of his lug wrench coming off each nut echoed off the empty highway and vanished into the desert. He was acutely aware of the vastness around them, the black silhouette of Granite Peak somewhere to the north, the endless basin stretching towards the lights of North Las Vegas somewhere behind him, and here, in the middle of it, 3 men in a flat tire. Except, it felt like 1 man and 2 statues. He finished the last nut and stood, brushing the grit from his knees. He straightened and looked at the 2 men, expecting what? A thank you? Some acknowledgement that he had stopped his car in the middle of the night and changed their tire for them? The first man turned his head, finally, and met James's eyes. His expression was not hostile. It was not grateful. It was not anything. It was the look of someone who seemed to know something about him that James was not aware of. The same long-suffering look a parent gives a child who thinks they're too clever. "That should hold you," he said. "The spare's a donut. Don't go over 50. After lowering the jack, James carefully lifted the flat tire and placed it in the empty trunk. Then he checked all the lug nuts again one more time on the ground to make sure nothing would come loose as they drove. He grabbed his jack in his right and the lug wrench in his left and headed for his car. Neither man responded. The first man's gaze tracked him without a change in expression. The second man remained motionless. James carefully secured his jack and the lug wrench in their correct places in the trunk before standing and closing it. As he turned to motion to the men that they could drive on ahead, he froze in momentary shock. Where the white sedan should have been, there was nothing. Nada. Just the vast emptiness of the desert. The sudden silence was immense, a physical pressure against his eardrums. The desert stretched away on all sides, silver and black under the pearlescent full moon. Joshua trees stood like frozen sentinels, their twisted arms reaching toward a sky salted with stars. Only the marks from his own tires marked the shoulder. The sleek white car was gone. The 2 men in white were gone. James turned in a slow circle once, then twice. The highway stretched north toward the moon path and south into absolute darkness. No taillights retreated in either direction. No engine note disturbed the silence. He crouched and pressed his palm flat against the asphalt where their car had rested. The surface was cool. He scanned the ground, searching for tire tracks, for oil stains, for the water residue from an air conditioner condenser, for any evidence that a vehicle had been parked here for hours with a flat tire. Nothing. The shoulder was undisturbed. No fresh marks in the gravel. No footprints or tire tracks leading away into the desert. The only tracks were his own and his Oldsmobile's. He straightened up, his heart beating hard against his ribs. Their headlights should have flashed across them. Their tires should have made a sound as they moved from the sand, across the gravel, and onto the tarmac. The engine should have made some noise. There was nothing. Nothing at all. The desert air, which had felt cool and clean moments ago, now pressed against his skin like something watching. He looked at his hands. The dirt marks from a dirty tire smeared across his palms. The proof was there, ground into the creases of his skin. He had touched their tire. He had felt the rubber, the cold metal of the rim, the grit of road dust on the inside of the wheel. His tools were still in the trunk, the lug wrench still carrying the memory of torque. He had changed their tire. He had spoken to them. They had stood right there. James stood motionless, his breath shallow. The moonlight fell on the empty highway, on the Joshua trees, on the distant peaks of the spring mountains. Everything was exactly as it should be. Nothing was out of place. Nothing was missing, except the two men and their car. Vanished, as though they had never been there at all. He walked to the exact spot where their rear tire had been. He knelt again, pressing his fingers into the dirt. The ground was hard-packed, undisturbed by the weight of a vehicle. He scraped at the surface with his fingernail. Dry. Untouched. His mind reached for an explanation and found nothing to hold on to. A tow truck, perhaps? Impossibly silent? A hallucination brought on by exhaustion? But he had felt the lug nuts tighten under his wrench. He had heard the first man take those steps. He rose and walked back to the Oldsmobile. His hand trembled as he opened the trunk. The jack lay where he had stowed it, the lug wrench beside it, still faintly warm from the friction of use. He touched the wrench's metal surface. It was real. The tire iron was real. The grease on his hands was real. The men were not. He closed the trunk with a soft thud that echoed across the empty desert. The sound traveled outward and did not return. He stood beside his car, one hand resting on the cool metal of the trunk lid, and stared at the empty space where two men in white shirts had stood. The vastness of the desert pressed in on him, and for the first time in his 23 years, James understood that the world contained things he could not explain, could not fix, could not outwork. His kindness had been answered with silence. His code of helpfulness had led him into a darkness that had no name. He climbed into the driver's seat and pulled the door shut, sealing himself inside the familiar cabin with its scent of dust and old vehicle. He gripped the steering wheel and stared through the windshield at the empty road ahead, his knuckles pale in the moonlit glow, and tried to remember how to breathe. The metallic click of the trunk latch still rang in his ears, a sound so ordinary it mocked everything that had just happened. James abruptly opened the door of his Oldsmobile and walked to the rear and pressed one hand flat against the cool metal of the trunk lid and stared at the empty stretch of moonlit asphalt where the white sedan had been. The road stretched north toward nothing and south toward the indiscernible glow of Las Vegas. And in both directions there was only desert, only silence, only the Joshua trees standing like witnesses who had already forgotten what they had seen. He pushed himself away from the car and walked to the center of the highway with a long gaze in both directions. The asphalt still held a faint warmth from the day's heat, radiating up through the soles of his boots. He again stopped exactly where the sedan's rear left tire had rested, where he had knelt in the grit and worked the lug nuts free, where his hands had touched metal and rubber that were undeniably real. The ground was bare. No tire tracks veered off into the sand, no oil stain, no scattered tools, nothing. Hello? His voice cracked on the word, and the desert swallowed it whole. No echo, no answer, just the vast, pressing silence of a world that had decided this moment never happened. He turned in a slow circle, scanning the darkness beyond the road. The moon was full, painting the desert in shades of silver and ink. He could see for miles in every direction. The bony arms of Joshua trees, the distant black shapes of mountains, the endless flat expanse of scrub and stone. A car did not simply vanish from a road like this. A car could not vanish. And yet the road was empty, and the silence was absolute. And the two men, in their pristine white shirts, were gone, as if they had never been there at all. A prickling sensation crawled up his spine and settled at the base of his skull. He knew the feeling from childhood nightmares, from the primal certainty that something unseen was watching from the dark. He spun around, his gaze raking the moonlit desert for any flicker of movement, any shadow that might explain what his rational mind refused to accept. Nothing moved. Nothing stirred, but the feeling did not fade. The air grew colder with the gradual chill of desert night. He called out again, louder this time. "Is anyone there?" The words fell into the silence and died. The silence continued, steady and indifferent, a vast, unending emptiness. It was simply there, presence as real as the road beneath his feet, and it offered no answers. James stood frozen, caught between the impulse to flee and the desperate need to understand. The two men had been real. He had touched their car. He had felt the weight of the tire iron in his hands, the grit of the lug nuts, the solid rubber of the spare. His hands still smelled of rubber and metal. The physical evidence was undeniable, but the world around him insisted that nothing had happened, that the road had always been empty, that the night had always been silent. His hands fumbled with the door handle, and he scrambled into the driver's seat, yanking the door shut behind him with a solid thud that cut out across the silence like a switch. The Oldsmobile's cabin enveloped him in its familiar scent of dust, of sawdust and drywall compound, the accumulated residue of 100 construction sites. He jammed the key into the ignition, and the engine roared to life. Its low, familiar knock, a sound so ordinary it nearly broke the spell of terror that had seized him. He fumbled with the radio knob, desperately trying to find something to interrupt the silence in his spiraling panic and settle his rushed breathing. He took one more quick glance into the rearview mirror. Still empty. Still nothing. He pulled onto the highway and drove south, away from Granite Peak, away from the sunrise he had planned to watch, away from the empty stretch of road where two men in white shirts had stood beside a car that no longer existed. The headlights cut a pale path through the darkness, and the desert rushed past in a blur of shadow and silver. The silence did not follow him, but as the miles unspooled beneath his tires, he could not shake the feeling that something else had. The memory of the men's dark, still eyes, their pristine white shirts, their absolute silence, it had seared itself into his mind like a brand. He had stopped to help because that was what you did. You helped people stranded on remote roads. It was a code as old as the desert itself, a simple rule that made the world feel safe and orderly and predictable. Now that code felt like a door he had opened without knowing what waited on the other side. He drove for an hour before he pulled over at a gas station on the outskirts of North Las Vegas, its fluorescent lights a garish beacon against the dark. He sat in the car for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the bright interior of the convenience store. A man in a baseball cap was buying coffee. A woman was filling her tank at the next pump. Everything was normal. Everything was ordinary. And yet, the silence still seemed steeped into his very bones, a phantom echo that refused to fade. He looked at his hands. They were still smudged with grease from the lug nuts, the dark crescents of dirt beneath his fingernails, undeniable proof that he had changed a tire. He had knelt on asphalt and worked to jack and tighten bolts. The physical evidence was written on his skin. But the car was gone, and the men were gone, and the desert had swallowed them without a trace. The world, James realized, was not the place he had believed it to be. Somewhere out there, beneath the moonlight and the Joshua trees, a road stretched north into emptiness, and on that road, a question waited that had no answer. He had stopped to help, and in return he had been given a mystery that would never let him go. He killed the engine and sat in silence, listening to the tick of the cooling metal and wondering if he would ever trust the ordinary again. Stories like that have a habit of sticking around. Now, I told you there was a grain of truth in my tonight's tale. So here's my challenge to you. Drop a comment below with your best guess. What parts of tonight's story do you think were true? And what parts were pure fantasy? Let me know where you think the line blurred. If you love exploring where the dark corners of truth and fiction meet, Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on our next gathering. Sleep well tonight, if you can.